All right, and hello, everyone. We are back with another Core One Future of Work talk. And our goal with these future work talks is to give us all a chance to dig into the fascinating work of our members that comprise our incredible growing community with a particular focus towards the future of work, future of economic systems like capitalism, future of democratic systems, and even the future of educational systems, especially from a professional context. Without further ado, I'd love to introduce our guest, David Preston. David has spent his extensive career supercharging learning for people and businesses. David, wonderful to have you here with us today. Welcome. Thank you so much. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Oh, thank you, Track. I really appreciate the kind introduction. I have always loved learning, and I've always had a love-hate relationship with the institutions and organizations that have amazing resources for the purpose. There's a wonderful little book called Orbiting the Giant Hairball by Gordon MacKenzie, former executive at Hallmark Cards, and he talks about being close enough to the resources to get the advantages of all of that educational real estate, gyms, multi-purpose rooms, computer labs, et cetera, but being told what to do and having to ask permission to go to the bathroom and not being able to speak except when called on doesn't really prepare us for a life that is dynamic and interdependent and where we're expected to communicate and be team players. So I finished a few degrees at UCLA and taught there for 11 years, ran a management consulting practice in Los Angeles. But then a friend of mine was starting a nonprofit and brought me along to help Los Angeles Unified School District administrators see their way clear to giving him permission to take high school students and middle school students out of the chain link pens and bring them to natural spaces where they could learn about ecology while stewarding the environment. And while I was doing that, the principal essentially said, "You academics are adorable. You have no idea what happens at schools on the days we don't give tours," and asked me to come teach. And I thought, this guy's out of his mind. And I went home and thought about it. And there was like a grain of sand that created a pearl in my mind somewhere. But I started having some sort of Hunter S. Thompson or Jane Goodall embedded anthropology fantasy. And I decided to teach for a year. I was going to do like a domestic Peace Corps. And so I called my consultants together, my clients. I didn't sell the business, but I gave them their books, said I'd be a resource. And I went to go teach. We make plans and God laughs. So I'm at I think it was the fifth largest high school in the country, 6,000 kids on a multi-track year-round calendar, 12-foot barbed wire. And I'll get to the end of this in a minute, but this bears a little explanation. LAPD substation on campus, child's care for the students' children. And it's like Gen Pop at your average low security prison. And this kid walks in with not only a book, which was unusual, but it was The Art of Happiness by the Dalai Lama, of all things. And so I dropped all pretense and just said, I give up. Where'd you come from? He had forged his parents' names on the paperwork and called them from the airport in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, to tell them he was getting on a plane for California, which is how he wound up in a warehouse instead of a brochure school like, Beverly Hills High School or whatever. So he learns English, passes his classes, and graduates. And then he invited me home for dinner. And for reasons I may never understand, I said yes, and wound up spending a month in Western China, Mongolia, and making a foray into Tibet with this kid and his family. Needless to say, bells rung that I have not yet been able to unring. So when I got back, I called my consultants together again and said, this is going to take me a whole lot longer than I thought. And I took a job teaching on California's Central Coast. I had been in the urban jungle. This was time for kind of like the heartland by the sea. So semi-rural. Then it was Tea Party. Now it's MAGA country. And what I've learned over the years is not only how to constructively break stuff in support of learners and people who support them, but also as we had the pandemic and campus lockdowns, as my former clients and colleagues have often wondered, whatever became of me and would I ever return to consulting? I'm back out of the classroom and working again with organizations. But whereas I once had a broad photo of anything on the people side of business, leadership, conflict management, delegation, team building, all that good stuff, now I'm pretty focused on building individual, team, group, and organizational learning communities and capacities. And that work is everything, because if you look around at all of our problems, school isn't designed to support our understanding of this stuff. Our voting, our international politics, our environment, we got some big stuff we need to tackle. And the level of thinking that caused the past is not going to help us in the future, which, sorry for the long-winded answer, but that brings us to today.
Not at all, David. Do you have a hard stop, or do you have like an extra 2 hours added in to this conversation? Can we?
For learning, I've got the rest of my life.
Wow. Okay. Fantastic. So look, that is absolutely fascinating. Curious where you are now. And I think, again, from our conversation yesterday, so the crux of this is that these experiences that you had, these bells that were rung, informed how you approach professional education, how you approach your business or your clients. What I like to talk about, and it's somewhat of a leading the witness question, but hey, we pick the guests here, but
It's your court.
yeah, exactly. Why? What did you find throughout this experience that made you believe that we need to uncouple education from this model of traditional in-school learning? Like, how is the model flawed? What are the ramifications, and how are you sort of working to fix that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think every kid in every generation has their experience with authority figures in schools that makes them wonder, can't we be doing any better than this? And for generations, the social contract was, Track, I know Mrs. Johnson's a big personality and this isn't fair what she's doing in this class, but here's how you're going to need to get along and follow the rules and play the game, because if you get your diploma or your certificate of completion, you're going to be okay. We don't have that anymore. And right around the time that my friend was asking me to help him with this nonprofit, I was listening in a different way to my graduate students at UCLA and my clients in the private sector, some of whom were in the creative industries in Los Angeles, some of whom were in, predictably boring but necessary, really brass tacks kinds of businesses. And they were all saying the same thing, which was they had to privately heal from their formal education just to feel whole and survive in the world, much less thrive in their chosen professions or their creative endeavors. And just to put a little context around that, we're talking a year or two after 9/11. So thinking and its costs were on everybody's mind, or at least they were on my mind at that time. And when I was thinking about getting into teaching, I really wasn't thinking about getting into it, but when I contemplated taking that principal's offer, it was really from the standpoint of every generation complains about school. Is it really that bad? Has it really changed that much? And the answer was yes, partly because it really hadn't changed that much, but the world around us has. So it's an irony to me that in the 20th century, we had viable alternative philosophies and models of education, Montessori, Waldorf, Reggio Emilia. Some of those still exist, but we don't have anything for the information age. And so I constructively made an effort. I figured the worst thing I could do was get myself kicked out, which would be an interesting story, and then I'd just go back to consulting. But I started breaking stuff using the public internet, creating opportunities for students to answer big questions and figure out what they wanted to learn, and curate in multiple media and collaborate with people around the world, because everywhere else we were in the middle of this amazing communications revolution, but it wasn't getting through to students and nobody was teaching about it. The internet's over 50 years old and we still don't have an awareness campaign or a curriculum that helps people. So that's where I started doing things that eventually became known as open source learning.
Let's talk about open source learning, a very grandiose name for something. Why don't you tell us what that approach is?
Yeah. Well, it's grandiose in the sense that it was aspirational. I had friends who, including Chris Carfey, who introduced you and me, who were the first supporters of what I was doing in the classroom. They were all the people who were around at the nascent stages of the internet and understood its capabilities and its potentials. So yeah, I was trying to piggyback on a phrase that people were familiar with open source, but it was also very much literal in the sense that, first of all, it's not proprietary. I didn't copyright the name. It's like the sriracha of learning. If you want to claim it, great. You're probably doing an element of it in your life, whether you know it or not, and I want you to get credit for it. The geek in me, though, also was thinking about thermodynamic systems and open source systems, open systems, not only exchange light and heat with their environments, but they exchange substances. They exchange components. And so when you think about the average classroom, the teacher is not the best resource for most things. They are an authority figure that's there to keep control. In the old world, when all we had was the textbook as a portal to understanding, they were the administrator of education from that standpoint. But I had a kid in my class who wanted to learn to fly. What am I going to do with that? In open systems, I can introduce him to a pilot. And 3 months later, and this is a true story that actually became the preface to my book, I was in the backseat of a Piper Tri-Pacer 3,000 feet above our initial conversation.
And yet I don't even want my daughter to get a license until she's 27, which is, you are certainly a brave person, but that must have been an amazing experience.
Well, good.
I
By
know
the
you.
way, just so that you know, I have skin in the game. My daughter's 14, going on 30. And part of what moved me throughout this process was being a parent. Not from the standpoint that I wanted to bully other teachers into doing things my way, which is all too often what we see in the media, people getting up at school board meetings and howling about whatever book they don't like. When my daughter learns to drive, no one is going to clear off the freeway for her. She's going to have to develop the capacities to keep herself safe, be mindful of her surroundings, and navigate effectively through a world that really wasn't designed for her well-being. And that's the societal order of things. It's a natural order of things. So when I started doing this, I was mindful and intentional about how this might work. Partly because, the only difference between having to defend yourself against the pack of lions and giving a TED Talk is having a title and a theoretical framework that people understand. Open source learning for me involved individual fitness for learning, mental fitness. How much do we understand about our neurology or our ability to be mindful and concentrate or remember or navigate our emotions? How physically fit are we? How do we eat? How do we exercise? How do we rest? Don't get me started about the trauma of PE, but that's not it. How do we engage in civic fitness? That can be picking up litter. It can be reading a voter's manual. It can be volunteering. It can be managing your personal finances. But we exist in a social order, and school doesn't really teach us much beyond the classic social studies books, which if you were educated in North Carolina at a certain age, you were learning about, right? Right. I learned this from you yesterday. Was it good slave owners you were telling me about?
Indeed, it was. It was some masters treated their slaves really well, according to North Carolina Middle School social studies text.
So I may not always remember what I say because I don't like to lie, and that makes my life easier, but I'll almost always remember what you say. So mental fitness, physical fitness, civic fitness, spiritual fitness, not religion, but the looking out over the ocean or the Grand Canyon or up at the night sky and realizing we are part of something larger. And there is a finiteness to our lives. And what does that mean for our day-to-day awareness of being in the world and operating? And then lastly, technological fitness. I mentioned the internet, but that's not the only tool around us that we can avail of ourselves. We talked about driving to start this little riff, and most of us understand how to drive. Almost none of us understand what happens when we have a mechanical failure.
Also, depending on what kind of car you drive, when you pop the hood, it's impossible to even see a chart. Or maybe there are no parts there because it's just a storage compartment. But yes, it is funny. I used to be the director of comms for a 3D printing startup that did industrial 3D printing. And so I learned a lot about manufacturing. One of the most alarming things that I learned in terms of technological fitness was that the median age of mechanical engineers in this country is like 47. It's just, people don't know how to physically build things anymore. It's sort of the internet and the gold rush of software development, in addition to all sorts of other civic things involving trade and tariffs and outsourcing labor to other countries, has really robbed us of that competency that used to just be kind of tantamount to other fields of engineering that we now associate more closely with engineering. It is wild how these types of things happen.
Yeah, and most people at this point in the conversation point to Robert Pirsig and Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. My personal favorite, though, is a book called Shop Class as Soulcraft by Matthew Crawford. It's a wonderful little read. And Anybody who's ever just done some tinkering and forgotten about the rest of their lives, even for a few minutes to figure something out, it's everything wonderful about being alive when you finally solve that.
I'm so jealous of people who have actual workshop spaces in their home, even if just like a garage that's all theirs, because I find it so difficult to finish every problem that I start solving. And so what inevitably ends up is there's just piles of little components and things distributed throughout my house in various trays on top of, dressers while I continue that problem solving process. Well, hey, I know I wanted to ask you this because I know you love movies, much like myself. And when we were talking through that sort of the model of the classroom and the learning structures and even the participation of the teacher, do you find it strange or wild that we have so many kind of classic examples of what most teachers and classrooms aren't in our popular culture? We have things like, Dead Poet Society and Stand and Deliver and all these very inspirational things of teachers who are not teaching the way that the traditional, method or business or whatever you want to call it is advocating for. And they're always treated as these, inspirational, but also, dangerous to the system type things. Why is that? I understand it's more entertaining, but for something that is clearly such an aspiration of, say, a Western conscious of we want these, leaders and these mentors, why is it so hard to find or scale that?
Yeah. So I always like reminding myself, whether I'm thinking about written word and literature or movies or music, that didn't just come into being. Somebody thought long and hard and applied a lot of love and craft and knowledge and insight to create this thing. Who is that person and what were they thinking? And it's kind of like the people who were confiding in me about essentially rescuing themselves from their own educations formally to become the people that they were when I met them, or at least be in process. The self-help industry in our country is billions and billions of dollars because people are out there seeking something better and something more. When it comes to those archetypes, you mentioned Dead Poet Society, Scent of a Woman, the list goes on and on, right? Mr. Holland's Opus. We're sense-making machines, yes, but we also have deeply human unmet needs. And we're out there trying to find that humanity, that spark, love, connection, kindred spiritedness that allows us to feel not so alone when we're looking at the world in the same way and thinking like, is this it? So I think a lot of those teachers are the teachers that we wished we had, or the one teacher that we met that was the exception that proved the rule. And because we're kids, when we meet teachers, this is the problem of institutional education. That I told you yesterday, the inmates who won the zoo tend to run the zoo. The people who were good at the game of school, got their teaching credential or their administrative credential, turn around and inflict the same thing on the next generation. I'm a weirdo because I couldn't stand that and left, but then came back to fuck with it. And what I see in those roles, what I see in the people upon whom those roles were based is passion, love, messiness, risk, care, everything that makes us human and desirous of something beyond what we're being told is okay. If I pause there and say part two of that, we have a very tortured relationship with passion and curiosity. So on the one hand, we like to espouse go boldly in the direction of your dreams, or life is a daring adventure or nothing. But unless you're Thoreau or Helen Keller or Anne Frank or any one of these wonderful heroes that we put up on the posters, you're going to the principal's office, or you're being told for the nth time to pay attention without any understanding of what that means by someone who doesn't obviously practice what they preach. And
Or
I think,
if you're under the age of 10 years old, you are given copious amounts of amphetamines.
right. Well, so yeah, and it's not age specific. If you watch the nightly news nationally, probably you're over the age of 60, and over 60 to 70%. I know you're in PR of those commercials are funded by big pharma, who are largely ransoming your health from big food which processed you out of good health to begin with. I mean, yes, we can go down a lot of those rabbit holes, but that's exactly why the fitness has become so important. Because at the end of all of this, I don't use words like students, teachers, and administrators unless I'm trying to translate. It's learners, lead learners, and stewards. And that's not school specific. That works everywhere. So for anyone who is consulting, if you're doing a Salesforce engagement, or if you're doing a strategic planning engagement, it still works. The content is almost irrelevant because it's the people and the process. And by the way, I look at people as processes. We recycle our skin every 7 years. And if you eat something that doesn't agree with you, you understand that you're a different entity now on the toilet than you were 6 hours ago. But we do have the power to effect change. So a long way back around to your question, I think that those archetypes exist because the people who go into making movies are usually the people who didn't feel like they fit in at school and found a kindred spirit somewhere worth telling a story about and bringing it to us. And last add on this, there was a wonderful documentary that won an Academy Award last year about real people. And now I'm combining the movies and the workshop combination, but there was a documentary called The Last Workshop about people who repair musical instruments in Los Angeles Unified School District. And the story was it's for free. It's on YouTube. It's like 20 minutes. It's the best 20 minutes you're going to spend today.
I think you're doing yourself a disservice with that comment, but I will certainly check out that YouTube. So we have just a wondrous amount of participation coming from the chat. One of the questions or just requests concerns Howard Rheingold. Let's just pause on that for a moment because I wanted, like, as much as I think probably everyone in the audience and myself included are, incredibly fascinated with education and sort of this retrospective. Let's talk a little bit more about professional learning, especially in context of the information age, right? Because here at Quorum, we think about like Hank, myself, Steven, and Ed, we've been doing so much thought work around this idea of the information age. Not necessarily on the kind of morality of it, like whether it was good or bad. We're kind of leaning in one direction in terms of the repercussions have not really delivered on the kind of promise of the information. And at this point, we're experiencing this kind of neurological overload. Right. So with that, sort of through the lens of that, how do you see professional learning or kind of the lack thereof impacting companies, particularly as this information age and the pace of change and turns into something that we're kind of softly titling the exponential age? As all that accelerates, like how is professional learning, what's the role that professional learning is going to play there?
Well, I think, whenever we label something professional, we're making really two distinctions. First, it's the something that's worthy enough to cost money or earn money. But second, we're making a distinction between that and amateur, which diminishes the word amateur, which anybody who ever studied Latin knows that's somebody who loves what they do. Ama, right? And I think that, we're at a point where it's all good and fine to point out that Steve Jobs went to Reed College and studied calligraphy, and say that the humanities have a role somewhere. But I love amateurs. I love people who are exploring because they care about what they do. My daughter will tell you from before it was like a hipstery thing to put into the language fountain, and everybody talked about making food with love. My daughter will tell you from the time we've been making pancakes when she was 2, that's the secret ingredient to everything we do. And the same is true for the word philosophy. To be a philosopher is to be a lover of wisdom. And I was going to say at heart, this is all about heart. So at the risk of being redundant, so there. But when it comes to professional learning, everything good in your life came out of learning. Even when you learn something that initially felt traumatic or shocking or like bad news, better that you should be aware. I can't think of an instance where that's, I'm not talking about gossipy stuff, but everything good in our lives, and that extends to our organizations. So, when I first read David Graeber's Bullshit Jobs and thought deeply about, when did we make the transition from just proving our worth in an organization and calling ourselves a director of learning, as opposed to genuinely sitting down and listening for an opportunity to help someone meet a need or improve a skill or achieve an outcome through mastering a skill or through mastering a concept. Things get a whole lot easier before they actually get harder. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but when it comes to professional learning, like school, organizations have adopted those practices because where do we learn about learning? And this is why the uncoupling of learning in school is so important to me. We tend to learn about schooling in a classroom environment where it's a one-to-many broadcast. So the training rooms in a lot of companies look like the classrooms in a lot of schools. That doesn't need to be that way. And every learning experience could theoretically come with online curation and community that is 24/7 available and supportive for reinforcement purposes, for critique purposes. We're not using the tools of our age to their best, potential. And I think a big part of that starts, I know that most of Quorum operates in a consulting capacity in one field or another, but it starts with asking a question and really listening to the answers. Because if people they may not have a goal in mind, but they definitely have a pain point that they're willing to talk about. And as soon as that surfaces, what do we need to learn around that becomes a natural extension of the conversation. And it doesn't need to be in those words, but I don't see how you can be a professional and not learn because things are changing so fast.
100% agreed. In fact, last week we were having a conversation with another core member, Saskia Ferras, who, we were sort of talking about the ideal of sort of the professional world or even the amateur love. Side note, I do love that we distinguish loving what you do and not loving what you do based on whether you're getting paid for it, because the idea that we could get paid for something that we love to do is so silly that, anyway.
Think about this. And by the way, I don't want to forget Howard because I heard that part of your question too.
Yeah.
But imagine, so we both have daughters. Imagine at like that magic age, like 5, 6 years old. One of our daughters spends an hour and a half making the perfect birthday card for daddy. And just like, this is the most proud she's been of anything she's created in a long time. Oh, you got something?
Yeah. I mean, 3 days ago, it was Father's Day, 2 days ago. So
right. I love show and tell.
This is mixed, This is mixed media. This has texture. It's on a canvas. I didn't even know we had canvas in our house.
That's awesome.
It's like this amazing melange of ransom letter. And, I love it.
So all the love that goes into that, and what would have happened in the next moment if you would have said, "Yeah, that's nice." So what do I do?
Would have, yeah. Well, one, she would have said, $1 trillion, or 5 jelly beans, right? As I bet.
Well, she has unusual. Thanks to her parents, she probably has an unusual presence of mind and confidence. But for most people, it takes the air right out of the balloon.
Yeah.
And the implication that people are only doing things for money. This is a big part of the problematic. We're building a sandcastle in a swamp because today's young people are growing up in a socially mediated world. Jonathan Haidt just wrote a wonderful book called The Anxiety Generation, in which he likens, would you let some company come and raise your kid on Mars for a few years? And essentially, we are overprotecting kids in real life and underprotecting kids online to the point where there was a time for all of us and all of our clients when if you made a chair, and going back to the concept of passionate curiosity and love, and you dedicated yourself to making the best, most comfortable, most aesthetically appealing Mies van der Rohe can suck at chair, and this was the chair that everyone wanted, well, at that point, value is a symptom. The less chairs there are of that sort, the more the price goes up. Elasticity of demand, we can talk about what would go into how much the chair is worth. But now we're doing things back asswards, and we're thinking about the dollars, and we're looking at, well, how much can I drop ship crap from China? Or how much can I be an influencer of whatever? And we've gone from marketing departments to Clue Train Manifesto and Gonzo marketing and influencer marketing and portability to people saying, no, I'm just going to use AI and I'm getting more clicks off of my ads anyway. And we don't even see those transitions because most of us don't even know those tools exist. And we still think we're looking at something real when we're on a screen. And I want to
it does not help that the current overlords of a lot of these platforms are actively working to make them less useful in order to stem the inevitable decrease of the number of people that are getting online. So instead of users, we have metrics like queries, which
Right.
if you're talking about something like a search engine or anything you're looking to access information from, is a terrible metric for utility,
Right.
because you shouldn't have to keep asking it what you need. It should just work the first time, right? And I would say, I think that a lot of generations, I mean, of the younger generations, I don't think they notice it because they were sort of born into this, but I think there's this collective kind of micro trauma of us remembering when technology was useful and it no longer delivering the same kind of, I don't know, dopamine or synaptic feedback because they're shittier products.
Yeah. And it's easy to become cynical. And, I mentioned using the tools of our age. I was on a research team at UCLA. This is 30 years ago. And we were looking at assessment. And the traditional model of multiple choice testing is all or nothing. If you select B, you are either 100% right or 0% right. We created something called information reference testing, which essentially, if you imagine A, B, and C as the apices of a triangle with gradations of uncertainty in between, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, and then flat out for I don't know in the middle, and gave learners the choice A through. So if I know for sure it's not B, but it could be A, it's probably C though. I could get partial credit for a partially right answer. Now, I'm saying this because what do we really care about? Is it assessment scores that we can compare with other districts or regions or nations to get funding or to tell a story? Or is it distinguishing a learner who knows correctly with confidence from a learner who's not sure and may need some review, from a learner who thinks she knows and actually is flat out incorrect and needs a completely different intervention to unlearn what she thinks she knows and learn anew? Now, that's especially important in adult learning and professional learning because we have increasing levels of ego involved associated with someone's perceived confidence in their job and how others perceive them. But the reason I'm bringing it up is because no, those companies don't have learners or individual well-being in mind. That's not what they're there for, because we're based on a profit to shareholder model. That brings me to why I started talking about open source learning as a thing, because I want to invite more people to these conversations in their organizations, in their schools, in their families, in their own lives. We can all, you don't have to be sick to get better, right? We can all do better. So the first time I decided to roll this out publicly, a student of mine, a learner in my community, in my network, brought me this contest. It was a think tank in Palo Alto called the Institute for the Future, who was running this open call for proposals about California's future. And one of the threads was education. So I submitted something called the Open Source School. This is 2011. And they named it one of their winners, and they invited me to Palo Alto. And I gave this talk. And I'm about 3 minutes in at the front of a crowded room. And having been at UCLA at that point for a long time, and then in LA for a long time, you never really know who's the eccentric genius entrepreneur and who's the homeless guy waiting for the bus. And sometimes they're the same person. But about 3 minutes in, this guy wanders right up the aisle to about 2 feet in front of me and sits down cross-legged on the floor with his JanSport backpack and his hand-painted Vans. And he looked, had a bushy mustache. He looked like the Lorax. And that was Howard Rheingold. And Howard and I became friends. I learned so much from him. I still do. I love Howard. And we just saw the world in the same way and saw learning in the same way. And he was kind enough. I'm going to pimp this, but only because you asked. So I wrote a book called Academy of One. I don't know if it's clear there. But Howard was nice enough to write the foreword and talk about his own experience in schools and how he implemented open source learning in his classes at Berkeley and Stanford, and how he wished he had done similar stuff sooner because, like me, he introduced the concept and then left the room. And what he saw happen afterward was nothing short of magical. But I think it was Forbes or Fortune called Howard an elder of the internet. There's just a few special people who, A, were there when the internet was created and helped chronicle its development, both technologically and culturally. But B, the guy is just a mensch. I'm so honored to know Howard. So I'm glad whoever brought him up. Thank you.
I think it was our mutual friend Charles.
I was going to guess, but I wasn't sure.
Yeah. Oh, they're all there. They're watching. They all hear us. What was I gonna say? I would love for you to share the story that you shared with me yesterday about your, I think it was a high school student that named something for you. That was one. I don't know if you remember this, but
Um, so now it seems like I'm describing a Model T Ford when I talk about blogging as a way to encourage online community and curation. But for a long time, that was the predominant tool that I used when I was teaching K through 12 high school courses. Somewhere along the way, I developed a practice of not just putting up agendas or projects or focused discussions or even resources, but I got into it and I would blog, on the course blog as though it were my blog and, hey, this is interesting and check this out and whatever. And that led me every term to end with a personal note. And that was almost always a note of gratitude. I was genuinely grateful. When you think about organizational life, we talk about the number, limiting the number of direct reports for the sake of efficiency, but also relationship building. Well, when you're a high school teacher, you have about 150, 173 direct reports, most of whom wish they were somewhere else, some of whom can't do the job they're being asked to do, and all of whom aren't given the time or space they need to be fully invested in the working relationship. So I did my very best to get to know all of my learners and let them get to know me. And sharing through the blog was one of those ways. So at any rate, at the end of this one particular term in 2015 or 2016, I said, thank you for taking this journey with me and taking these risks together and being ourselves out loud and doing this stuff. And one of them commented, no, thank you, Dr. Preston. This was lit AF. Now, at first I didn't notice it because it happened to be an AP lit course. So I thought advanced, I just went right over my head. And then I went, wait a minute. And being a middle-aged white guy, I had no idea what she was talking about. So like an irresponsible internet denizen, I went right to Urban Dictionary and looked it up. And I thought it was just fucking hilarious. So when I stopped teaching, like everybody, I read Hamlet and The Great Gatsby and whatever else when I was in high school. And I did just enough to get the grades. I read the chapter summaries or the back of the book or whatever, and I wrote the papers and did the thing. But part of the reason we don't give those works of literature credit, when you asked about movies, one of the phrases that came up in my mind was that fiction is the lie that tells the truth. And I don't remember. Do you know who said that? I don't remember off the top of my head in this moment.
Sounds real familiar. If only there were a website that could answer any question I could ever.
Yeah, I'll go to Quote Hunter later. But I think that, a lot of the reason that high school is the way it is because a lot of young people don't have the experiential hooks or the psychological capacity or the emotional capacity. And that's not any criticism of them as individuals. It's what they've been given to work with environmentally, as well as genetically, as well as energetic. I mean, this goes into, are they getting their sleep? Are they on, Fortnite until 4 a.m? Are they exercising? Are they able to process their parents' divorce? There's so much that goes on, and it's almost all cortisol all the time. I worked in some pretty violent communities, but even the most, suburban bedroom, okay on the surface high school, today's kids are not okay. And I think that particularly in that environment, it's really hard to look at Hamlet and look at Spark Notes and think, well, it's just another moody decision-making disorder teenager. No, it's not really about that at all. To be or not to be is not the way that it's taught. And if you think about The Great Gatsby and you go, oh, well, the green light at the end of Daisy's dock, I get symbolism. No, you don't. Unless you know that F. Scott Fitzgerald's wife was such a raging, abusive, alcoholic wretch that he felt so broken that Ernest Hemingway dragged him to the men's room of a restaurant and made him show him his dick to reassure him he wasn't completely broken. You don't understand that book. And so when I came back to teach this stuff and I started learning for real about what went into creating these works of literature, I kind of had my holy shit moment. And then, of course, because they're all in the public domain, if they're old enough, they're mine to play with. And so I started a podcast called Lit AF, and it started as storytelling for adults. I've expanded it though, because I've been so fortunate to meet people like Howard Rheingold and Jamie Ian Swiss, who's a master critical thinker and a world-class magician, and Bobby Maximus, who's like one of the men's fitness 100 fittest men of all time, and learn from them out loud in front of students as a lead learner, that I've now incorporated storytellers into the podcast. And I'm not good enough at it where I've made it a real thing yet, but there are some episodes floating around here and there that people can find. And as I get it together, if I continue, I'll make sure that I share it with the quorum folks.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, normally I wrap these things up with asking for those exact type of things, like, the things you want to plug, whether you wrote a book, you did, whether you have a podcast, you do. You also, throughout the course of this conversation, have listed something like 7 other sources of literature or whatnot. But yes. So I think much to my earlier comment about queries and things not returning the results you want, I've gotten several answers on the fiction is the lie that tells the truth. Camus evidently said it. No surprise there. I probably should have known that because that's what I did my thesis on. Graphic novelist and writer and also screenwriter Neil Gaiman also said that it's possible he was just also read Camus when he was a high schooler. And then someone named Abraham Verghese wrote a novel called The Covenant Water, where he also writes that. Exactly. So who knows what came first, right? In the words of Michael Scott, who knows where words come from? So I wanted to tell you, actually, throughout our conversation, you reminded me of something. I did have the privilege of working at a very learning focused, actual Silicon Valley tech company, and that company was Twilio. And one of the things that I noticed immediately about Twilio is that I would say your assertion is correct, of course, that basically all of the training and learning situations look and feel like school, right? And that's what it was. It was a bunch of people at conference room. There was a singular focus of attention in terms of, and they got Twilio is that they wanted every single person, they encouraged every single person, it wasn't mandated, to learn how to build things with their code, with their product, with their software. And I, of course, wanted to get into the nuts and bolts of it, as it were. So I was in this sort of classroom with one of our developer advocates that was teaching us, walking us through and doing the tutorials. And there was a woman that was also taking the class at the same time as me. And she was probably 2 or 3 levels senior to me, different department. But for all intents and purposes, an extremely capable and accomplished person, right? And there was a moment where, as we were, I think, just trying to set up a cloud hosting so we had somewhere to put our app, the person that was doing the presentation skipped to the next slide and she lost it. Like, not in like an angry way, but she got so scared just immediately, just this like fight or flight response. Like, I don't know why, can you go back? Can you go back? I don't know. And I sort of, had a Matrix bullet time moment thinking about, what could she possibly be so scared of, right? There's no, in this case, like, there was no test. There was no, like pop quiz, or there was no, sorry, this is the last chance you'll be able to look at this. And then you just have to figure it out after that. And it just, I thought about, that's how school teaches us to think, right? Yeah. This is your only chance. And if you get this wrong, your performance goes down. Where the developer advocate was like, hey, well, I'll just go back to the previous slide. It's okay. Like, we're all here to learn the same thing. There's no timetable, and it was fascinating.
Yeah, and it's also slightly heartbreaking and also heartening. And I heard that scenario at about 3 different levels. At one level, it reminded me of some of my experiences, because when I began asking learners, hey, do you want to do things differently this year? And encouraging them really to participate in the decision making, some of them didn't know what to do with that because they had never been asked. And when I asked them, like I asked you yesterday, hey, what would you really want to learn? Forget all the requirements and the courses and the stuff for just a second. Forget that time and money is always on our minds. What are you really wondering about? What would be interesting for you to explore? And some people, even a smart-ass reply, can I go to the bathroom? Wonderful question. We've got all sorts of issues about power, plumbing, hydraulics, can versus may. There's a lot that we can make out of any question. Every question is interdisciplinary. But I thought that well, teenagers want independence. They're going to chomp at the bit and just take this and run with it. No, it's messy. It's, first of all of that passionate curiosity has atrophied from the time that they were really excited to learn at 4 years old and then started getting smacked for everything, literally and figuratively. But also that there's a deep suspicion of other people at some point. Like, wait a minute, what's really going on here? Where's the trap? And what am I going to be on the hook for if I miss this slide? And that's the segue to my next level of thinking about this, which is, like you, I was thinking, man, that's a tough spot. But the third level is empathy, because what school doesn't offer, we can. And as consultants, really at the end of the day, that's what we're there for. We're a person who's not in the organization day to day, who's a safe outlet. Doesn't mean therapy, it doesn't mean confidant necessarily, but we can listen and hold that and say, yeah, I can understand why you're thinking that way. I'm wondering what we can do about that to meet the need for, whether it's order, for all I know, that person might be on the spectrum. That person might be neurodiverse in a way that says, hey, if something goes out of order, then we need to pause and have a conversation and make sure that things are okay. And I think that over the years, from the time I was a learner myself and wondered why my first grade teacher was pulling kids' hair when they got math problems wrong, to when I saw an opportunity to help people do things in different ways and started working for a consulting firm when I was a graduate student, to then in my late 20s, looking at that firm and going, well, I love the work, but I hate these people and they don't have to be so pompous and weird. And maybe I can do this differently and create a different working culture for consultants and the work they do, to teaching at UCLA, to teaching in high school, all the way up to that moment and imagining what kinds of engagements quorum members have. There's a lot of really wonderful opportunities to support learning just through this simple moment of kindness.
Well, David, it's hard to imagine that we could end on a better and happier, more optimistic note. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you to the audience who just gave us all sorts of wonderful questions. David, it was a pleasure to have you. I feel like we've plugged the vast majority of things that you could plug. Is there anything else?
So a couple of things. I am on davidpreston.net, and that's the website where you can find me most easily. My email is david@davidpreston.net. And I'm well aware that any conversation, especially where I can't see the learners, is the beginning of something else. So please feel free, whether it's the Quorum Slack or via email, to ask me anything, continue the conversation. But Chris Carfey, who introduced you and I, he and I are working on trying to help people toward figuring out how to use Web3 and other elements of emerging technology to not only curate their interdisciplinary multimedia learning adventures and answer their own big questions in the process, but also we create value in learning. This conversation we could have had in private, we could have had an email, but we created value by curating it where other people could participate, hopefully think different thoughts than they would have this morning or this afternoon, wherever they are in the world. And using Web3 and some of the things that Chris is doing with Unlock Protocol, for example, but also that, I just started using Workcast and some other fun stuff, where the likes and the queries and the follows had their day. I think now the idea that we can mint and that we can essentially reward people for adding value to our lives is the next logical step in this evolution. And I gave a talk about being on chain and learning at MIT in, 2018, the before times. But I think we're at a point now where if there's anybody who is interested in more of that conversation, especially, or in bringing learning to a different level with your clients, I'd be happy to support that. So thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Just to recap, we had open source learning, we had the 5 fitnesses, and we had non-fungible teaching. That's what it's I imagine that this recording this session is going to be a beloved resource for many years to come. It's been a fantastic conversation, David, and thank you once again. And hey, speaking of which, you should hop in to our Slack instance sometime and take a look under the hood. There's lots of moving parts there.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day.